Thank you, Sean. Thank you, guys. What a great turnout. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so two things before we started. First, I probably added too many slides to my presentation, so I have to speed things up a little bit. I'm sorry. And the second one is that this is not my exit seminar. This has nothing to do with my research whatsoever. I'm just doing this because I'm about to graduate, and it was sort of my last chance to present any Tropilunch. But also because I do believe that RED Plus and the RED money can be used to support many of conservation and development initiatives that people from TCD work with. And you know, sometimes we simply don't have enough money to fund those projects, those initiatives, and RED Plus can potentially be a tool to do that. So with that, this is the outline of the presentation. I'm going to start with the basic concepts and then build it up and then use the Acre's program, RED Plus program as an example of everything that I'm talking about. And then hopefully we'll have time and I'll show you some cool pictures about carbon markets. Okay. So first base question, what is a carbon credit? There's a really straightforward answer to that. One carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of CO2 that is removed from the atmosphere or that is not emitted to the atmosphere, okay? And they have this E right here, which stands for equivalent. And that is because CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas that we have. There are other greenhouse gases, and some of them are actually way more powerful than CO2. For instance, methane. Methane is 21 times stronger than CO2. Those numbers vary a little bit. You can see. You're fine. So the thing is, you can still generate carbon credits by reducing methane, for instance. But because methane is so much more powerful than CO2, if you reduce 1 ton of methane, you actually get 21 carbon credits, and so on and so forth for all the gases, okay? And here we're going to be focusing on forest issues. So we're mainly talking about CO2, a little bit of methane, a little bit of nitrogen, but not about these other guys, these super powerful guys. Those are more related to the industrial sector. All right, so how do you create those carbon credits? Again, you can either promote CO2 sequestration to the establishment of forests, reforestation, or you can reduce emissions from fossil fuel emissions, for instance. But there are new and arguably really cool ways to do that. For instance, to promote sequestration, this is a pilot filter that you can find in China. And the idea is that these filters, they remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. And they make diamonds out of that. How cool is that? But still, those are pilot studies. But those are things that we might see coming up, right? And of course, you can also reduce emissions from deforestation. And we're going to talk a lot about that, right? So that is... It's called RED. It stands for Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And what a lot of people miss when they're talking about RED Plus is that this plus sign stands for the role of conservation, sustainable forest management, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. Okay, so this is RED Plus. Is RED plus all these other activities. All right, and these are, for instance, some RED activities. So avoid deforestation, arguably reforestation. Some people say that this is actually not part of RED Plus, but according to the official documents from the United Nations, this is arguably considered part of RED Plus. And you can also have activities such as improved forest management. And here the example is, on this side we have a forest that was logged conventionally. So you can see the amount of degradation that we have in the forest after logging. And on the other side, it's a forest log with reduced impact logging techniques, so there's much less damage to the residual stand. Okay, so this could also be considered a REDD+ activity. And overall, there is a complex view of REDD+. You can view REDD+, you can use a social view or a political view or economic view. But in this presentation, I'm gonna mostly be focused on technical issues, basic concepts related to REDD+. So how to create a carbon credit under REDD+, for instance. Well, this Chris came up with this really interesting draw here. But there's something wrong with this. And it says you would revert to woodland anyway. Okay? And this has to do with a concept that's critical to all those climate change mitigation activities that is referred to as additionality. For instance, in terms of reforestation, your project will only have additionality if, for instance, the present condition of your landscape is a degraded landscape. You will only have additionality if continues to be a degraded landscape in the future. If you think that the landscape will eventually become a forest, then you don't need REDD money to promote deforestation in that landscape. So there is no additionality, okay? And the same goes for avoided deforestation, for REDD. If you have a forest that you think is going to remain as forest in the future, then you also don't need REDD money to avoid the conversion of that forest, okay? And this caused a lot of discussion in the literature because if you think about it, forests that belong to big farmers in the deforestation frontier, they're very likely to be converted to pastures or whatever. But forests that belong to a poor community in the middle of the Amazon is unlikely to be converted, so it's unlikely to have additionality. So the way that REDD+ is framed right now, at least under the voluntary carbon market, is that actually those communities would never benefit from REDD. On the other hand, maybe rich farmers would benefit from it. Okay, but this is just it really depends on the context that we are talking about. This is just an overall idea. A lot of people don't like REDD because of that. All right. So let's see where this REDD money is coming from. Where this carbon offsets, this carbon credits come from. So here we have a graph with the carbon stock on the y-axis through time. So we have a baseline. The baseline is a degraded landscape. This is for a reforestation activity. So if we're using REDD money to promote reforestation, we have an increase in the amount of carbon over time. And the carbon credits, they come from this additional carbon. So there's always this comparison between your REDD scenario and your baseline. Okay. The same goes for avoided deforestation. You have a forest, you need to somehow project what's going to happen to that forest. And then what is the scenario under REDD, the protection scenario. And then again, you have this additional carbon. This is what's going to create the carbon credits. And the same thing for forest management activities. For instance, the example that I showed you, reduce conventional logging here, then you can have reduced impact logging, you also have such. Okay? Another important concept is called leakage. And leakage refers to this. You can have a project area where you have a degraded landscape. And of course, and maybe close by you have a patch of forest. So the idea is to promote reforestation in this landscape. But because you do that, you might displace you might displace the activity from your project area to a nearby area, and that can cause carbon emissions. This is called leakage. It's the displacement of emissions as opposed to reduction of emissions. Okay, and if you have leakage, you need to discount from those additional carbon volumes that I showed you. Okay. So those are the main concepts, arguably the main concepts behind RED activities. But who buys those carbon credits? So arguably this boom about carbon credits started with the Kyoto Protocol. You can see in the literature some examples of people buying carbon offsets and selling, but arguably it got really popular with the Kyoto Protocol. Does anyone know what? Do you guys know what is the Kyoto Protocol? Everybody, raise your hand if you don't know what is the Kyoto Protocol. Okay. So the idea behind the Kyoto Protocol is that developed countries, they need to reduce their emissions, and they can offset part of their emissions by buying carbon credits. That's the idea. So under the Kyoto Protocol, there was arguably this compliance market that was created, and then countries were buying carbon credits to offset their emissions. Okay? And the catch is that under the Kyoto Protocol, you could only create carbon credits from forest activities if they come from reforestation. We're not talking about RED. But with all this attention to climate change, a lot of organizations realize that they should do something about it. And maybe they're doing that because of green marketing, maybe they have other reasons, but a lot of companies, they were like, you know what, I want to offset my emissions too. I want to start buying carbon credits. So there was a demand for carbon credits. And that led some people to come up with specific voluntary standards to regulate sort of this market. So the idea is, you're a company, you want to offset your emissions. Well, I wrote this document and I came up with this cool website and I have rules. So you should buy the credits that I am certifying. Because then you can make sure that whatever you're buying is real. I will add credibility to your green marketing scheme, so on and so forth, okay? As opposed to here where the rules are set by the United Nations, basically. And here, under the voluntary carbon market, I'll give you some examples of what are those voluntary standards. Here you can have RED activities happen. Okay. But now, with the Paris Agreement and this idea that every country should do whatever they can to offset their emissions, there's arguably we're going to see arguably a merge between those two markets. I mean, basically the Kyoto Protocol doesn't even exist anymore. But the idea is that carbon from the voluntary carbon markets could be potentially used by countries to offset their emissions to reach the reduction levels that they said they would achieve under the United Nations. Okay? And the Paris Agreement clearly acknowledges RED+ as a way to promote carbon offsetting. Is this clear? Is this clear? Okay. Feel free to ask me anything during the presentation. So let me just show you some of those voluntary standards. Okay. And like I said, the idea is any of those standards, basically a group of people got together, they came up with rules, and they said, hey, these are my rules. Do you want to get certified under my rules? Fine. That will add credibility to your project, add credibility to your green marketing scheme, whatever. Each one of them it represents one standard. They have independent rules. And the biggest ones among them are the VCS and the CCBS. I'll show you some figures about them later on. Okay. But do you need to be certified under that standard to sell carbon credits from your project? No, you don't have to. It just adds credibility. And right now, I gotta tell you, it's basically impossible to sell carbon offsets from your project if that project's not certified. Okay? Maybe you can sell it to your uncle, but definitely you cannot sell to University of Florida or anything like that. Because they just look for that kind of credibility. Okay. Some steps, if you're developing a RED project, here are some steps that you need to follow. This is an image from a real project, by the way. So this is the current condition of the landscape. Those patches here represent deforestation, and here is probably 10 years back. So you can see that there is a major threat of deforestation to this project area, or at least it looks like. Okay. So the first thing you need to do, you need to, if you want to start a RED project, you need to have a carbon inventory in your area. You need to know how much carbon you have here on a per hectare basis. Okay? The second thing is you need to create a deforestation baseline, like I showed you before. And this is just an example from a different project, how this deforestation baseline looks like. So you have the initial year, you project it into the future. Arguably, this is not the best deforestation baseline ever modeled, right? Because this is a little overwhelming. But I'm only using this because it's a really nice picture, okay? This would never get approved under the VCS, for instance. This actually, okay, we don't have much time. But anyways, it looks like that, and you need to have it. And then you need to get a third-party certification. So you hire some auditors, they go to the field at the beginning of the project and do the validation. The certification process has two parts. The first, the validation at the beginning of the project, where auditors will go and see, oh, okay, the carbon inventory is right, the deforestation baseline looks right, okay, everything's right. And then you have, later on, another certification that's called verification, where the auditors, they go to the field, they see what is happening to your forest, and then they compare that to your baseline, and based on that difference, then they will issue the carbon credit. And it happens like this because RED was envisioned as a payment for performance. So the idea is you can have your carbon project, whatever. You're protecting 100 hectares. If 2, 3 years from now, you get auditors to go to your field to check the forest, and they see that there's no forest there whatsoever, you will not get paid. Okay, it's based on performance. Is this clear? So once the auditors say, okay, everything's fine, you get carbon credits issued by the standard that you choose. And then you can sell those in the market. Okay. This is just a map of all the forest carbon projects that you can find around the world. Most of them are here. And you can see that, okay, most of them are in the tropics, but you can see many of them in US, in Europe, all over the place. Okay. Okay. About RED funds, this is a map showing countries that are receiving RED money. Okay. You can see that most of the money is going or has been promised to Indonesia and Brazil. But I would like you to compare this map to this other one. This one is from the United Nations program on RED. Okay? And you can see that Brazil, for instance, is receiving RED money, but it's not even part of the UN RED program. UN RED program. And that's because there are many things happening with RED. The United Nations has a program, and countries can get money through the United Nations, but countries are also getting a lot of money from bilateral agreements. For instance, Norway is giving so much money to Indonesia, Brazil, for instance. I'll show that to you in a second. But I just wanted you to make this clear. If you're talking about RED, you're not necessarily talking about, or RED Plus, about you're not really under the United Nations, necessarily under this United Nations framework. Okay? All right. So another topic that caused a lot of discussion about RED is about its governance. So there's this idea of centralized governance versus decentralized governance. And I'm just giving you an example of what is happening to Brazil and how that would fit this idea of centralized and decentralized. So Brazil, for instance, has a working group from the government that's working on developing this national RED program from Brazil. Okay, one of the decrees that came up with is this one, and it's that one, and you can find this information in there. So RED plus offsets from Brazil cannot be used to offset emissions from other countries under the United Nations, meaning that countries cannot other countries cannot reduce their emissions using offsets carbon credits from Brazil. Okay. So this arguably is a centralized approach. At the same time, we have some RED projects happening, already implemented in Brazil. They are generating 4 million tons of CO2, and that's carbon credits per year. It's not a trivial amount. And they are selling those carbon market, those offsets in the market.
What's the rationale for this not offset?
I don't know. I have no idea. I'm sorry. I personally don't agree with this, and I talked with some of my colleagues about this, and they also think this is arguably not the best strategy for any country, because it sort of go against this idea of carbon credits as was proposed as part of this clean development mechanism that was established under the Kyoto Protocol, which was developed countries, they generate carbon credits, they sell them to developed countries. With that, they generate money that is invested in clean, sustainable development. So I don't know where they come from.
But if you sell all your cheap carbon credits outside, then Brazil, when it tries to meet its goals, is only going to have the more expensive emissions reductions options.
Yes, and that's great for my next slide. Okay. And this is just an example of where you can find some of those forest projects, arguably RED plus type of projects. Okay. So one of the problems with that is, for instance, double counting, and that gets to sort of your point. So let's assume that these are the emission reductions that Brazil have achieved, and Brazil wants to report this to the United Nations, okay, saying, I'm doing my part under the Paris Agreement, I've reduced this much. And of course, the new president is happy about it. But then those credits that were generated by some projects, they get sold to Germany. And Germany likes it, of course. But that means that Brazil has achieved less amount of reductions. And that's not good for the country when they are reporting that to United Nations. And of course, Brazil cannot count those emission reductions as part of Brazil's emission reductions because now they were sold to Germany. And if they do, then it's double count. All right. Okay. And there is a lot of discussion on this and RED governance. This is time for advertisement. Sorry. But if you're interested on that, this paper that I wrote talks about that, talks about those issues with centralized versus decentralized governance. And really, if you read anything about RED governance, you're going to see that what people are pushing for is not centralized or centralization or decentralization, but it's something that they call the nested approach for RED governance, which basically is, well, let's consider all of them. Why do we need to pick one? Let's just put everything together. And this is an example of this idea of nested governance for RED+, okay? The VCS, remember that I showed you that standard for the voluntary carbon market? The VCS, they have put a lot of work into design some rules for countries to be able to incorporate private, decentralized projects into national RED policies. Okay, and this is This is a figure from one of their documents. Let me just edit this figure a little bit to use that as an example, using already the Acre state. Okay? So let's assume that this square here represents the state of Acre. So you have red money coming. So this red money can be either allocated to the projects itself. Some will be directly allocated to the projects based on the area of those projects, and the rest will be allocated to the state of Acre. And this is a little confusing, but this is sort of the main idea behind that. Or another option would be all the red money goes to the state, and then the state decides what to do with that money, and then they send it to the projects. And it can be through other sorts of compensation. It can be money. It doesn't need to be the carbon offsets themselves. It can be other sorts of compensation. I'll talk a little bit more about that now that I'm talking about Acre's program. Okay, so if you don't know, Acre is located here in Brazil. Arguably is the greenish state in Brazil. Most of the state policy is focused on adding value to the forest and adding value to nature. And one of the programs that they have in Acre, arguably, is this program of incentives for environmental services. Okay? And if you look into the program, and if you look into the Acre state policy, you will see that they do have a sub-program, if you want to call it like that, that is focused on payments for environmental services. And here they acknowledge Rent Plus as one of their strategies. Okay. And what they did was to create their own carbon standard. They created this Acre carbon standard, and this is the cover of the document. And it's a nested. They are following a nested approach, and this is a figure that I took from that document. So basically, what we have is Brazil, and then Acre, of course, is one of the states in Brazil. So the idea is that they are following, they're inserted in this major framework, this national framework. Within the state of Acre, they have subnational programs to address this problem with deforestation, forest degradation, to promote better practice. Within the one of the programs within the state of Acre is this payment, carbon-based payment program. And then again, within this program, they have other sub-programs. It's quite confusing, but the idea is that everything is nested, okay? And then within, for instance, the program that is related to reforestation, then they have specific projects. Some of them are public, and some of them are private. And the idea is to incorporate everything together into this nested framework. Okay, and just so they wanted to be nested into this major framework. And Brazil is working on its national strategy for Rent Plus. Okay. And there are also other documents that Brazil has been produced for the United Nations, for instance, and they are all sort of connected. Okay, within that national strategy that Brazil has put together for RED, you can find this scheme. And I'm not gonna talk much about it. And this is what Brazil is doing. This is their chronogram. Is chronogram a word in English? Okay. So basically, they started with this idea in 2010, and by 2015, they published the national strategy. But really, Brazil is going to implement its national program by 2020. That's our deadline. Okay. Okay. Back to the state of Acre. So how is it going to work for Acre? The idea, what they have designed so far, is that the red money will go directly to the state of Acre, and then the state of Acre will allocate that money to different projects, and they can be public or private, and to the state itself. This is also a figure from that document. So I showed you at the beginning that if you have a red intervention, you need to come up with a baseline, right? This is the baseline, a deforestation baseline. This is the baseline that Acre is using. So it's based on a historical rate of deforestation. This is also what Brazil is using. So this goes with this idea of a nested approach, right? They are all in conformance with each other. So basically you have a national trend. Here you can actually see two deforestation trends, which is basically just an average. So they have one average, and this was the old average, and this red one, this is the new average. So basically, Acre is using this average. It's roughly 500,000 square kilometers of deforestation. Is that 1,000 or just 500 square kilometers? Okay, yeah, makes sense. I'm not sure if I missed them. But anyways, they are using this average annual deforestation rate to create their baseline. So this is their baseline of deforestation. Each year, they assume that they are going to clear roughly 500 square kilometers of forest in the state. Okay, this will make a little bit more sense when you put it into a table. So here is also from that document. They have the year. This is their baseline. So see that there is a difference in here. At the beginning, they were considered they were clearing 600 not hectares, it's square kilometers every year, and that was the yellow line that I showed you. And then they revised that baseline to almost 500, and that's why you see it over there. So they have an estimate of how much carbon they have in the forests in Acre. It's around 124 tons of carbon, not CO2 carbon, per hectare in their forest. So they use that to estimate how much carbon credits they should receive as the difference between this amount that they think are going to be cleared and whatever ended up being cleared. Okay. And with that, you have this additional carbon, this carbon offset. Does that make sense? I know it's a little confusing. Okay, but what is more important here is that, so this is the amount, when you do the math, this is the amount that you're going to reduce. This is the total. So from this total, they discount 10% as sort of an insurance buffer that they have. Okay. So this goes sort of to insurance. And then they say, 10% of this that we are reducing, we're going to allocate those 10% to projects. And when you discount those numbers, you have this final value. Okay. So this will go to the government, this will go to the projects. But there are a few things missing here. Oh. There's no leakage in this table. And if you show that to anyone that works with carbon credits, they will say, well, you might be just displacing your emissions to a different country or a different state. And another problem, this is a map of the red projects that are already going on in the state of Acre. Okay, so here we have 4, I know that there's another one there. The amount of offsets that those projects have generated and sold is already more than this amount that the state of Acre is saying it will allocate to the project. So now we need to fix this. We need to somehow insert those projects into this Acre red program. Okay. All right. And that's it for the Acre nested governance. So now just a few interesting figures about the carbon market. If you're interested in that, those are arguably the best reports that you can refer to. Most of them come from this institution, the Ecosystem Marketplace. And every year they have special reports on the voluntary carbon market and on the forest carbon market. And all the graphs that I'm going to show you come from at least one of them. Well, the first thing that you need to, if you really want to understand how this market works, you need to keep in mind that this is sort of a stock market. So it's really complicated. It can be really messy. It's hard to understand. A project developer who generates carbon offsets, he or she can sell that to brokers or to resellers. Those brokers will try to make money of that, so maybe they put some credits aside and try to sell it in the different year when the price is better. So there's all of those things happening. And eventually, there's this end buyer, and the end buyer can get the credits from the developers or the brokers or whatever. It's really messy. It can be really messy. This figure shows where those offsets that are being sold in the carbon market are coming from. What types of projects are generating those offsets, right? So we can see that most of them are being generated either by red projects or wind projects. Okay. And these are those are the volumes for 2015, the most recent volumes with the prices as well. So you can see that in 2015, most of the credits in the voluntary carbon market came from wind projects. And the average price paid for those was roughly $2. And then you have red plus type of projects. And people were paying $3.3 per carbon credit that come from those projects. Okay. And you can see that the other projects, well, they're not that relevant, but their prices can vary quite substantially. Oh, here? Oh, it just means, no, this is just the price range, and this just means that they did not plot the whole thing here. Because they vary so much. Okay? So that's important to keep in mind. The average doesn't tell you much. The price range varies too much. And this is just another, it's a similar picture, but just focused on sort of forest-based projects. To have sustainable agriculture, agroforestry, tree planting, forest management, two types of red. And you can see how those prices also vary a lot. Okay. Here we have some projections about what's going to happen. At the beginning, the demand was way higher than the supply, and that's when most of those carbon standards people started to create those carbon standards, right? It was a response to this. There was a lot of demand from different types of organizations who wanted to offset their emissions. There were not enough standards. There was nobody really certifying anything, so there was not a lot of credibility. But once you had those standards, and people started to work on multiple red projects, offsetting projects, then what happened is that there were more supply than demand. Okay, and you cannot quite see that in this graphic. But here they have projected what's going to happen in the future. Well, probably what's going to happen is between those two lines. So those are projected demands and those are projected supply. But really, I do believe that we're going to have more supply than demand. Unless, because of the Paris Agreement, suddenly a lot of countries, a lot of companies decided to try to offset their emissions, to comply with new regulations and things like that. Okay, but this is sort of what's happening. And in terms of market share, like I told you that the VCS and the CBS were the most important standards in the carbon market. And here you can see that they have more than 50% of the market. And probably the other standards will eventually disappear because everybody's using VCS, and VCS is ahead of the game. Like I showed you, they already came up with this jurisdictional document for countries who want to have this nested red governance, incorporating the private projects into the national policies. VCS is really doing a better job than all the others, and I believe this market share will. And here's something more interesting about the donations that have been made to countries and who is making those donations. Not to countries, but to REDD+ in general, right? So you can see that Norway is by far the most important player here. And then you have some money from other countries, Germany, United States, Japan. And some of those countries are just donating money to countries so they can work on their REDD programs, get it going, set up the rules. Other countries, they're already making payments for whatever the countries are already doing. And some of those payments, actually, the countries are doing it because they want to use those offsets, whatever offsets will be generated by whoever is receiving the money. They want to use those offsets, those carbon offsets, to offset their emissions. Okay, so whenever they report that to the United Nations, they say, well, this is how much I've emitted, this is how much I have offsetted from here, from there, whatever. So you can see that Norway actually is not that interested in offsetting their emissions, which is weird, right? At least according to this figure. I don't know. Sorry. And just out of curiosity, those are the main organizations buying carbon offsets from the voluntary carbon market. Okay.
So is it possible for the business to business?
Oh, this?
Yeah, exactly. So most of this is they buy the carbon from business to government.
Most of them are based on business to business, to specific projects, or from brokers. Sometimes they don't even know if the credit's coming from Brazil or Indonesia or Africa. They just know that there's someone in Europe selling 10,000 credits for a good price. They go and they buy it. It really depends on their strategy. Some of those organizations, they do it because they just want to say, I have offset my emissions for 2012, whatever. Some of them want to say, well, I offset my emissions, and look at those monkeys. I helped to save them. So those ones, they're really interested in this specific project. Some of them are just looking for the best price in the market. And it's like a stock market, really. Once a project have generated a carbon offset, it's almost like a commodity. So a lot of people don't care about that. A lot of people care about the marketing that they can do with that. And that's interesting because I've seen that happen actually. And I have a friend who's a broker and works with this, and he told me that they had a project, I think from Indonesia maybe, and in the cover of the project, there were some rent things. And because of that, the buyers were like, whoa, this is great for my company. I want to buy credits from this project. It doesn't matter that the other project was maybe way better, doing a greater job. They simply did not have a really good cover. So you can see all those kind of crazy things happen. Yeah, and guys, that's it. That's the whole presentation. Yeah. Thank you.